On August 7th, Alphabet closed down for a third straight session. $354.30, off about 1%, on a day when the S&P 500 rose 0.62% and NVIDIA gained more than 2%. 6% gone in 3 days. Roughly $285 billion of market value. And no bounce. That is the part everybody covered. Here is the part almost nobody did. 24 hours after Google took the chief executive title off its AI lab, that same lab published a paper in Nature that hands hurricane forecasters an extra full day of warning, and then put the model weights on GitHub for anyone to download. This is the follow-up. Last time we took apart the org chart. This time we are going to ignore it completely and look at what Google DeepMind actually shipped during the week it was supposedly falling apart. Because the conclusion you reach depends entirely on which scoreboard you are reading. Start with the numbers, because they got worse after our last episode, not better. Pulled from market data rather than headlines. Alphabet closed August 4th at $377.65, the last session before the announcement. August 5th, $362.43. August 6th, $357.75. August 7th, $354.30. That is 3 consecutive down days totaling 6.19%, against roughly 12.23 billion shares outstanding. That erases about $285 billion on a company now carrying a market capitalization near $4.3 trillion. The third day is the one that matters, because it removes the easy explanation. A one-day drop on a leadership announcement is a reflex. A 3-day slide while the broad market is climbing is a repricing. On August 7th, the S&P 500 closed up 0.62%. Microsoft was flat. Meta was up 0.37%. NVIDIA was up 2.27%. Alphabet was down about 1%. So this was not a bad tape dragging everyone down. Money kept moving into large-cap technology that day, and it specifically kept moving out of this one name. Quick recap for anyone joining now, and then we will leave it alone. On August 5th, Sundar Pichai announced that Demis Hassabis moves from chief executive of Google DeepMind to chair of Google DeepMind, plus a new Alphabet-level title, chief scientist. Corey Kavachouaglu, previously the lab's chief technology officer, takes daily operations as senior vice president, reporting to Pichai. The chief executive title was not handed over. It was removed. And Jeff Dean left after 27 years to found a public benefit corporation called Discovery Loop. We spent a whole episode on the mechanics of that. So for the rest of this one, forget the org chart entirely and just watch the output. On August 6th, one day after the reshuffle, Google DeepMind published in Nature. The model is called WeatherNext Cyclones. The claim is unusually clean for a machine learning paper. More than 24 hours of extra reliable lead time on a tropical cyclone. Not on one metric, on 3 at once. Track, meaning where the storm goes. Intensity, meaning how strong it gets. And wind structure, meaning how wide the damaging winds spread. The tagline the team used is that a 3-day forecast now matches the quality of a 2-day forecast from the previous generation. DeepMind characterizes that as roughly a decade of conventional meteorological progress delivered in one release. The architecture is where it gets interesting. This is not a language model wearing a raincoat. It uses what the team calls functional generative networks, a diffusion-based approach that outputs probability distributions rather than a single trajectory. It was trained on close to 20 terabytes of global atmospheric data, and then co-trained specifically on roughly 5,000 historical storms from IBTRACS, the International Archive of Best Track Cyclone Records. That second ingredient is the design choice. Most weather models are general purpose and cyclones are an afterthought. This one was pointed at cyclones deliberately, with a single unified architecture optimized for track, intensity, and wind structure together rather than 3 separate systems. Now the numbers that should make an atmospheric scientist sit up. 3-day track error lands near 100 kilometers, measured against the European ensemble, ECMWF-ENS. 3-day intensity error lands near 11 knots, measured against HWRF, the hurricane-specific physics model. The ensemble went from 50 members last year to 1,000 members now, which matters because cyclone forecasting is fundamentally a probability problem, not a single-line problem. And a full 15-day forecast generates in under 1 minute on a TPU. And here is the detail that reframes the whole thing. WeatherNext Cyclones runs at 28 by 28 kilometer resolution. That is roughly 100 times coarser than the physics-based models it is beating. In traditional numerical weather prediction, resolution is the ballgame. Finer grid, better forecast, more supercomputer hours. This model throws that trade away. It is beating 100 times finer simulations while running on a grid so coarse that a hurricane eyewall is a couple of pixels. That is the signature of a model that has learned the statistics of how storms actually behave, rather than one trying to simulate the atmosphere from first principles. It is the same shift that hit protein folding, applied to weather. Benchmarks are one thing. Here is the operational record, and it is the reason this paper is not just another leaderboard entry. During the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season, in October, the model flagged an 80% probability, 5 days in advance, that a developing system would intensify to Category 5 and strike Jamaica. At the time it made that call, the storm was still a Category 1. That storm became Hurricane Melissa, and it hit Jamaica as a catastrophic major hurricane. According to the reporting around the paper, it was the first time forecasters at the National Hurricane Center were able to make a Category 5 call while the storm was still at Category 1 strength. Think about what an extra day is actually worth in that context. Evacuation orders, hospital transfers, shutting down ports, moving fuel and generators, positioning relief supplies. These are logistics problems where the binding constraint is not money, it is hours. And the partner list tells you this is not a research demo looking for a use case. Google DeepMind and Google Research built this with the National Hurricane Center, which sits inside NOAA and the National Weather Service, with the Cooperative Institute for Research in the Atmosphere, and with the UK Met Office. Those are the institutions that issue the actual warnings. And then they gave it away. The code and the model weights are on GitHub in the Google DeepMind/WeatherNext repository under an Apache 2.0 license. As of the August 7th push, that repository sits at just over 7,000 stars. 3 variants shipped: WeatherNext Cyclones, WeatherNext 2, and WeatherNext 2 Mini, which is small enough to run in a free collab notebook in a browser. Hold that next to how the same industry treats frontier language model weights, which are guarded like reactor designs. The science line at DeepMind open sources. The product line does not. That is not an accident, and it is the theme this whole episode is about. Step back, and the pattern is hard to miss. Google DeepMind is not one lab. It is 2 businesses sharing a building, a compute budget, and a brand. Business 1 is scientific discovery. AlphaFold for protein structure, AlphaGenome for genome function, AlphaVol for algorithm optimization, WeatherNext for atmospheric forecasting, and Isomorphic Labs for drug design. Business 2 is the Gemini stack, frontier language models, the consumer app, the developer platform, and the search and workspace integrations that Alphabet's revenue actually depends on. These 2 businesses have different customers, different release cadences, different definitions of winning, and now, formally, different bosses. The science line has been running hot all summer, and it did not stop for the reorganization. On July 16th, 3 weeks before the shakeup, Google DeepMind and Isomorphic Labs published a joint approach to what they call bioresilience, prevention, detection, and response for biological threats. Concretely, adapting the SynthID watermarking system to screen AI-generated biological sequences, using AlphaVolve to optimize metagenomic sequencing algorithms so outbreaks get identified faster, and deploying Isomorphic's drug design engine for pandemic response. The Post says they advanced more than 15 partnerships with government and biosecurity bodies over the previous 12 months. Read the August 5th reshuffle through that lens, and it looks less like a demotion and more like a divorce settlement. Hassabis takes the science line, chair of Google DeepMind, chief scientist of Alphabet, and he remains chief executive of Isomorphic Labs, which he has publicly called the top application of AI for human health. Cavusoglu takes the product line, and his resume is precisely that of a shipping engineer. Aerospace degrees from Middle East Technical University, a doctorate under Jan LeCun at New York University, at DeepMind since 2012, name on AlphaGo and WaveNet, Chief Technology Officer, and since June 2025, also Chief AI Architect, the role explicitly created to push models into Google products. 2 leaders, 2 mandates, 1 building. Here is the attention asymmetry, measured rather than asserted. We use Hacker News as a thermometer for developer attention. Pichai's leadership post on August 5th. 860 points, 929 comments. The WeatherNext Cyclone paper, which landed the next day and hit the front page on August 8th, for 131 points, 127 comments. So the org chart got roughly double the votes and 7 times the argument. And Hacker News is the friendly audience. In the general financial press, the ratio was far more lopsided than that. The reason is simple. The scoreboard the market uses has 1 column, and that column is frontier language model capability. On that column, Google still has a hole. Gemini 3.5 Pro was promised at the developer conference in May, within a month. On July 21st, Google shipped 3 flash-tier models and confirmed Pro still was not ready. As of August 8th, the newest rumor points at August 12th, and that date is unconfirmed by Google, so treat it as a rumor. No official benchmarks, no pricing, no model card. Until that ships, every other release, including a Nature paper, reads to the market as a distraction. The developers noticed the mismatch, and they were funny about it. The top-voted joke in the WeatherNext thread, Imagine the meeting. Demi says, I have an amazing new breakthrough. Sundar says, great, we really need an answer to our rivals. Demi says, they are completely owned in typhoon forecasting. Underneath the joke sits a serious complaint. One commenter pointed out that Google's earthquake early warning system has shipped on every Android phone for years, for free, while the conversation is entirely about whether its coding agent is slightly behind the state of the art. Another replied, correctly, that you are allowed to hold both thoughts at once. That is the honest position here. So what actually resolves this? Number 1, obviously, Gemini 3.5 Pro. Not whether it ships, but how it benchmarks on coding and long-horizon agentic tasks specifically, because that is the column the market is grading. If it lands, and it is genuinely competitive, the 3-day slide gets forgotten inside a week. If it slips again, the 4th delay stops being a schedule problem and becomes a capability story. Number 2, whether the science line keeps its throughput now that the Gemini org runs day-to-day operations. The stress test is already on the table. The Financial Times reported in late July that the AlphaFold team had been dismantled and folded toward Gemini work. WeatherNext proves the science engine was still firing as of August 6th. The open question is whether that was momentum from work started 18 months ago, or a pipeline that keeps refilling. Watch the next 12 months of Nature and Science submissions with a Google DeepMind affiliation. That is a slow signal, but it is an honest one. Number 3, and this is the underrated one, whether open sourcing the weather weights becomes a pattern or stays an exception. Apache 2.0 on a state-of-the-art forecasting model is a strategic choice, not a charity one. It makes Google the default infrastructure layer for an entire scientific field, the same way AlphaFold Structure Database made it the default for structural biology. If Alphabet keeps giving away the science models while locking the language models, then what we watched in the first week of August was not a company losing its way. It was a company deciding, explicitly, which of its 2 labs is the product and which one is the moat. To sum it up, in the same 72 hours, Google DeepMind lost the chief executive title on its own lab, watched its parent company shed roughly $285 billion over 3 sessions, published in Nature, added more than a full day of hurricane warning for the agencies that issue evacuation orders, and gave the weights away under an open license. Every one of those is true at once, and any story that uses only some of them is selling you a mood. The scoreboard the market reads has one column, and Google has a hole in it until Gemini 3.5 Pro lands. The scoreboard the world will read in 10 years has more columns than that. Which one turns out to matter is genuinely undecided, and that is why this is worth following rather than concluding. Facts and sources only, and nothing here is investment advice. If this was useful, subscribe, because we follow the stories that keep developing instead of the ones that just trend. This has been AI Daily.